Hello, my name is Geeth. Today, welcome to Digital Journeys, where we go through the lives and developments of those in our digital community and practicing clinicians. So today, I'm going to welcome Azeem.
Thanks so much for having me on, Geeth. Really appreciate it. So, yeah, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Azeem. I'm a doctor by background. I did all of my kind of medical school journey and foundation training in London with the aim of becoming an academic general surgeon, which absolutely did not happen. And then after kind of my foundation years, took some time out, moved over to the States initially to work in the music industry for my F3, then came back, started building a company. Our first product was called Byte Medicine in the edtech space, then moved into tech myself, working at a company called Sarah Care, then built the next part of the business, which was called ByteLabs, which is a digital health training fellowship in the UK and the US, and now kind of juggling those bits alongside some consulting and venture work and a radiology registrar in my spare time as well.
So, what would you say? There's so many things that you're doing. One thing I know, so you went out to the States and you did some, is it songwriting for
Hmm.
proclaimed artists? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I before medical school, my plan was to do music. Like I had my first publishing deal when I was about 14, 15 years old. I wanted to do music full time, but ended up at medical school instead. So the plan was after post kind of F2, I would try and go back into music again. Worked with Atlantic Records and APG Publishing in LA. Flew out there straight after F2. Worked with some really cool people. Remarkable time, like living next to the palm trees and the beach and in the studios and flying around the west coast of the States. And unfortunately, largely came back because of COVID, and that's when the business started.
So, would you say, do any of the stuff that you learned over there? I mean, that's quite a very unique kind of F3 opportunity. Do you think any of those stuff spurred you on to be successful, to start your own business, to kind of see things from a different perspective, as it were?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, like for me, music was something that, like, I always wanted to, like I said, when I was younger. So when I was about 15 years old, like the only way I got my foot in the door as a songwriter anyway, and like major publishing with major publishing labels was just kind of cold calling and spamming like 1,000+ managers and publishers when I was about 13 years old. And I think more that experience, I would say, guided me into like entrepreneurship in
Mm.
retrospect, essentially, like not being fearful of rejection and being able to put your foot out, take the kind of foot out the boat and really just take the
Have that
risk
leap of
of,
faith.
yeah, exactly. And I'd say probably that experience rather than taking the F3 itself. Like people do all sorts of really cool things for F3s. This was probably slightly different, but if I hadn't had those experiences as a teenager, I probably wouldn't have taken the risk anyway. So I guess it's like asymmetric bets and wanting to do things that you enjoy in the time that you have, essentially.
Yeah, fair. So, speaking of the time that you have, I mean, you hold multiple roles, whether that be a co-founder in a startup, product leads. You said you do venture capital and a bit of consulting. I mean, what does a week in the life actually look like for yourself in terms of balancing all the clinical commitments and
Hmm.
having all those? It just doesn't feel like there's any enough hours in the day. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's been a challenge for sure, just trying to navigate the different bits and pieces I'm up to during the week. And I think the greatest risk is trying to do too many things and doing an average job at all of them and not doing any of them particularly well, which is something I've always been wary of. So, I'm a radiology trainee. I'm less than full time, so I'm in the hospital kind of 2.5 to 3 days a week generally. Then alongside that, in the evenings for an hour or so, catching up on the business stuff, and the remaining 2 days of the week largely doing business, and then like a few hours of consulting. And then I act as kind of a venture scout for a few organizations, so listening to startups pitching and that kind of stuff. So I try and time box all the work within the Monday to Friday with very little spilling into the weekend. I think that's quite sacred time, and that's how it should be. But yeah, I think it's just trying to be as organized as I can, and that often fails. And I think like I've hit burnout multiple times in my careers, and that's kind of career so far, and that manifests in various different ways. But I think at this point I've kind of learnt what burnout looks like, and kind of when you just need to take a step back from whatever role that may be. It's not really the quantity of accruing roles, it's kind of just doing as few things as well as you can. That's basically the conclusion I came to.
What does burnout look like? Would you say is it stress? It's just not doing the job you want as well, or is it
Hmm.
is something a little bit more nuanced than that?
It probably varies for everyone. I think everyone experiences the precursors to burnout in a slightly different way, and then burnout is a somewhat ubiquitous process in terms of how that manifests. So, burnout, like the pre burnout phase for me, is just like you say, when I'm at work doing one job, I'm thinking about the work of another job. So, essentially, context switching. And then that leads to a lack of productivity, a little bit of brain fog. For me, sometimes I get anxious about the various bits and pieces I'm doing. So, like early morning waking because of anxiety, and then having to work to like kind of get rid of the anxiety. And then the more work accrues and the anxiety grows until the point where you just can't really function anymore. And there's this kind of profound brain fog over everything you do, and you just need to completely switch off. And then if I personally don't recognize those things early on enough, then I guess you spiral, and then you have like full blown burnout. But I think I've slowly recognized those kind of precursors, I guess, before the actual burnout occurs.
I think that's really useful. I mean, especially for those who want to get into digital health, there's no strict pathway, as it were. It's not like academic where you can do an ACF, you can be a lecturer. There's kind of a set pathway. It's a lot of the time you are doing things out of your own volition, your own time, and risk burnout. So I thought that was pretty interesting. In terms of the venture capital and the consultancy stuff, I mean, we did some work together for Lantern. That's how we
Yeah.
ended up knowing each other. But how did you end up going into that field? Do you have any tips or tricks for anyone who's looking to get into that?
So I think so from a venture side of things, I'm not a VC. I don't know. I'm not a venture partner. I act as a scout largely. So I work with larger funds and venture organizations to tap into largely kind of the health tech, life sciences, biotech talent within the UK and Europe. And that's just because you know the vast majority of my friends, if not all of them at medical school, unfortunately didn't practice medicine afterwards. They all went on to do other things. So whether that is consulting, digital health, they started their own companies and raised funding. And that network then, I guess, kind of spiraled from there, that you meet friends of friends and, second and third degree connections. And I guess through that process and then building ByteLabs, just having access to a pretty large digital health ecosystem within the UK and Europe, and being able to get your eyes on deals before even these companies are raising funding. This is largely what VCs want access to, is like really deep technical talent in companies with really strong moats, ruthless founders with remarkable execution that are moving at speed. And they want to get in there at the ground floor, arguably before they're even raising. And the single best way that you can do that is by building a great network around you. And thankfully, as I said, through friends and the wider network, that's something I've managed to do somewhat serendipitously. So that's kind of if you're acting as a scout, that is the greatest thing that is being optimized for, is how well do you know the ecosystem around you? How much are people going to be approaching you actively to share what they're building? And that is, the single greatest advantage if you're acting as a scout and trying to kind of double down and niche down on a specific area. So for me, it's broadly speaking health, but obviously like acting as a scout doesn't pay the bills, right? Like you get a little bit of carry at the end of the process, but this is something that I do largely out of enjoyment because I love hearing what incredible companies are building these phenomenally innovative products across Europe. But you're not paid for that work up front. You're paid in carry at the end of the process, which can be lucrative. But as I said, often there's a 5, 10 plus year waiting period for that to occur.
Okay, fine.
So that's kind of my work in venture. Obviously, if anyone listening is looking to go into actually work in VC, then definitely chat to someone who's had that journey. Like, plenty of doctors who have gone and done MBAs and moved into venture, for example. Yeah, that's the venture side of things. Consulting is largely, I've done consulting with Sarah after I left and getting our research and development and peer-reviewed publications out there. And then most of the consulting I do now is via the ByteLabs process. So companies reach out to us and they want talent to work on projects for them. And then I help negotiate the deals and get the right talent in the right places and oversee some of those projects.
Okay, interesting. Well, no, that sounds hectic, but it sounds like you gain a lot of enjoyment from it. It gives you a lot of purpose. In
Yep.
terms of, so do you find your skills in clinical medicine help transition to your skills in terms of the digital side, in terms of working in startup, and in particularly, like for our listeners, are there particular skills that they should hone, invest in terms of their clinical side that could be translated well effectively to the startup world? I mean, I guess you see a lot of that when you go through ByteLabs, you see the people presenting, etc., and how they work in teams. Maybe do you notice something in terms of clinical that could be beneficial?
I think the classic answer to this is that people on the front line know the problems better than anyone else. And, that is somewhat of a cliche at this point, but it's probably the truest thing when it comes to like clinicians building tech products or trying to be entrepreneurial. And that is true. I think the problems that clinicians see on the front line, so for example, as a radiologist, I know the challenges on a daily basis that the average consultant radiologist experiences and what potential solutions could be built for those problems. But that is like very much the very early kind of ideation stage of any company or product. Like that is the bare minimum that a company should have, is knowing its problem area incredibly well and being able to validate that successfully. And clinicians are pretty good at that because they see it firsthand, but they're good at identifying a problem, but not necessarily validating the problem. And that is the slower, more patient process that is required that we see in our program. Is we, like, for example, we'll have a cardiologist and we'll put them on a problem to do with, ACS and managing ACS in the cath lab, for example, and some of the practicalities behind that. And they'll say, yes, in my day-to-day basis, I notice X problem. And then the key thing there is being able to validate that and seeing whether that's a ubiquitous problem across 90+% of cardiologists. And then I guess taking a step back and emotionally detaching yourself from the problem is something that clinicians often struggle with, because these are pain points that are so intrinsic in the work that they're doing that they're not able to detach themselves from like building a problem or building a solution for a problem that they experience versus building a solution for a problem that can actually be monetized and scaled international. And that is kind of this push and pull that I often see with clinicians. In terms of like what clinicians can do to further maximize their skill sets within their clinical work to then translate that into digital health, I think it's actually just opening your eyes on a day-to-day basis and not just accepting the status quo for the work that you're doing. So Geeth, like you're an orthopaedic reg, when you're doing your day-to-day work, whether that is with surgical devices or prostheses or implants or whatever it may be, from a more of a biomedical engineering perspective, it's going to be like, why are we doing things the way we're doing? Why are we using this hammer and this nail specifically? Why are we taking this approach? Why is this operation taking X amount of time when actually if we did things slightly differently, it could take Y amount of time? And that, when we started ByteLabs actually like almost 3 years ago, the most important thing that we positively selected for when we had people applying was the intrinsic desire and ability to challenge the status quo and not just accept how things have been done is always how they need to be done. So I'd suggest, like, as a first thing, is just as a thought experiment, is when you next go to work and the work that you're doing as a clinician, try and tease out where are areas that could be optimized, and then talk to people about those areas and try and validate that as a problem. And read, like, the number one book in terms of validating problems is the mum test, and it gives really, really great advice on how to validate a problem. Essentially, don't ask your mum about the startup you're building because your mum loves you and will always tell you how great it is. It's about talking about problems, not solutions. And I know it's kind of a wishy-washy answer because it's not like a hardcore technical skill. In my opinion, clinicians should not be spending years and years trying to become the best full stack developer unless that's something they really, really want to do, because you're going to be competing with people who've been doing this since, like, now 12 years old, right? You have plenty of other transferable skills that are non-technical that could really, really stand you in good stead if you're trying to build a career in this space.
Awesome. That is some amazing advice. I love the mum argument. Definitely don't ask your mum. She's going to tell you it's going to go great. It's going to go great. But no, that's and your experience in ByteLabs where you've seen people come through, do you think people, because they're so ingrained in those ideas, do you think they find it hard to pivot sometimes when their idea is not going the right way? Or I guess the other thing as a clinician, you're not really, you're thinking about solving the solution, like you said, but you're not thinking about monetizing it in the long term. I guess in terms of scalability, you need to have those tests or those pilots and validate it externally if everyone else is having the right problem. And I understand from ByteLabs, you do the presentation, you have your idea and you pitch it, have you had a lot of companies come out of that saying, now we're going to develop a company, we're going to scale it, and we're actually going to test it out?
ByteLabs in its initial form anyway it wasn't designed to be an accelerator program. Like, it wasn't designed to build companies. It was designed to upskill a workforce. The general ethos behind why we were built was that we believe that this next generation of clinicians will practice medicine through the products they build, not just the patients they see. And that ethos does not mean we want every clinician to go out and build their own company. Absolutely not. What we mean is we need clinicians to actually be able to identify things that can be improved and know hypothetically how they could improve those things. So as you say, like at demo day, our groups, they will present projects they've been working on alongside a mentor. They've been validating a problem statement. They've been coming up with a business model and trying to come up with some kind of plan of commercializing the solution that they've developed. In terms of the actual companies that have come out from the problems we've given fellows, no companies have come from that process, because that is not what the process is designed for. This is designed for flexing those muscles. How do you calculate a TAM, ZAM, and a SOM? What does the regulatory and compliance landscape look like in the UK? What does the pipeline of development look like when it comes to clinical product management? And this is for clinicians who have like never ever thought about these things before. So it's flexing those muscles and understanding what that process looks like. And then what happens is that that process positively selects for people saying, I just have so loved that process of validation to almost deployment that I want to go and build my own things. So this year alone, our alumni have raised around 10 to 11 million pounds of funding for startups that they've then gone on to develop. And they've gone through their own accelerator programs, Entrepreneur First and Zinc and Antler. Some haven't even done that. They've just raised funding for their own startups, and they are, they're scaling, and they've gone down, class 1 and 2, etc., medical device processes. So yeah, I think I'm glad actually that none of the projects have led to companies, because that's not what it's designed for. To build a startup it's not an 8-week part-time process. It is about going all in, full-time, ideally, on something and taking that asymmetrical bet that this is something that you want to build that's going to change the world. We aren't designed right now to do that. Fingers crossed next year we have other plans for how we integrate those processes in. But largely speaking, the fellows that really loved ByteLabs then go on to build companies because they realize that's kind of now what they love to do.
Yeah, fair enough. No, I'd agree with that. I think, like you said, building a company over 8 weeks, doing it part-time, especially I think, because you get put in teams with the people. It's not, you don't choose the people. You kind of are in a way forced to work with them. But in some ways that's good, because ideally when you have your own company, you'll choose the people. And I think that's one of the biggest decisions you'll make, who are your partners and who are your co-founders. Whilst there, you're kind of forced to work with other people, but then in the other hand, you get to identify what makes them good, how to identify other people and bring it out of them.
Yeah. And I guess the biggest comparator our program is not building a company, it's joining a tech company, and that you have no choice of the people that you're working with when you're joining a Google Health or a Flow Health or AccuRx. Like, you are dumped in with a team that is, some those people may know each other quite well, or they may not. But the whole point is no one has any choice as to the people they work with generally when they're joining a tech company. And that's why we do it, because we don't want people to necessarily even know each other. We don't want people to have those relationships. It's about how do you navigate those push and pull factors and like the different skill sets, kind of like a multidisciplinary approach. And you just have to make things work, right? Like there's no other option. And yeah, building a startup is different to that, right? Like, you should be remarkably selective as to like the co-founders you build with.
Yeah, otherwise it all goes to pot, doesn't it? No, that is an interesting take. But so you talked about a few of the key skills or skills you can bring from a clinical setting to the startup world. Is there a skill that no one talks about? It's very underrated, apart from the obvious ones like grit, perseverance. Is there something that you find is underrated that is needed if you're going to succeed in the digital landscape?
Yeah, once again, skill. When people ask me this question, people are often expecting very, very specific answers. They're like, oh, you need to learn JavaScript and you need to understand CSS and you need to make sure that you understand user design really well and that you can use Figma really well. I personally don't really believe that there is no like one tool set of skills that you need to learn. I would say the single biggest positive predictor of success, whether it is as a clinician, either in the tech space or building your own company is being comfortable with ambiguity. And once again, some people may not say that's a skill. I personally do think it's a skill, more like an attribute, I guess, or a personality trait that some people have and some people can develop. But what I mean by that is there's twofold here, right? You've got personal comfort with ambiguity, and then you've got building a product and being comfortable with ambiguity. So when I say personal comfort with ambiguity, what I mean is, as you alluded to earlier on, Geeth, you said clinical training is essentially like a conveyor belt. Like there is a set process that you go down, and you know pretty much from the age of 15, 16 years old, that if you keep at this thing for long enough, you're going to be a consultant in insert specialty, and you'll then do that specialty probably for the rest of your life, a few decades until you retire and die, right? Like that is the nihilistic view somewhat of like medical training, and there's absolutely nothing
Very
wrong with that.
nihilistic, yeah.
There's absolutely nothing wrong
You
with
die
that. Yeah.
after you fix your last hip. Like, great, thanks.
And I say that like somewhat tongue in cheek, right? Like it's and there's a lot of beauty in that because it provides stability. You're probably always going to have a job for life, and you get really, really deep domain expertise, and you become amazing at what you do. And the vast majority of people, they stay in the hospital that they trained in or nearby, and they stay in that hospital for the rest of my career. Like my dad, for example, like he trained as a urologist. He's been doing that for 40 years. He hasn't moved to the hospital that he's worked in. He's had one employer, and he absolutely loves what he does. And if you're thinking, okay, actually, maybe there's more to my professional career than that, and there's other things I want to be exploring. Well, being comfortable going less than full time, being comfortable taking year after year out of training, exploring what those interests are. Like I did at F3, F4, F5. I'm pretty sure I did at F6 as well. And being comfortable seeing your friends progressing in inverted commas in other areas of their career and like going along that stepwise approach and essentially taking a step back and taking time to explore what you really want to be doing. You have to be comfortable in the ambiguity of not necessarily knowing what those next few years are going to look like. And also then linked to that is trying to cut out this like comparative mindset of comparing yourself to other people who have gone down that route. So that is the single psychological stumbling block that is greatest amongst clinicians who want to do other things or explore other interests, but physically can't because of those psychological challenges, which are somewhat instilled in you from a very young age, right? So that's kind of what I mean about ambiguity in your personal career development. And then I guess from a startup side of things is, I can't remember the statistic, 90% of startups are going to fail in 1 year, right? And certainly beyond that, 99% are going to fail. So it's being comfortable with that statistic. And you mentioned like grit and determination. All those things are, you obviously need those if you're trying to build your own company, but also you need to be comfortable with the fact that there is ambiguity in the years ahead. And you don't know what that looks like, but if you were a betting person, you would bet on yourself that you will be successful in what you're doing. And you believe in yourself more than anyone around you is ever going to believe in you. So once again, a little bit cliche, but there is so much ambiguity outside of a medical career that there's very little, like the vast majority of people don't work in the NHS. Like most people don't work in the NHS or public sector. They work in some job where the job security is far less than as a clinician in the NHS. And they're not even sure whether they like the company they're working with. They're going to maybe move company next year. And there is ambiguity in that process, but that's how the majority of people live. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just making sure that you challenge these mindsets and these views that you've had early on. Otherwise, you're always going to be drawn back to the thing that is comfortable, potentially at risk of then not exploring the things that you could be really great at and you want to be doing.
Fair. I think that's so well said. The other point of it is when you're a clinician, like you said, you do have certain things that, for instance, the income, you have job security, that you can take those risks, whether it be going less than full time, whether it be doing your own startup. And I think there's a lot to be said about that because I've stayed full time. I mean, this is the only year that I've been less than full time, but I managed to do other things and I feel comfortable, I guess being in the space I am whilst reaching out and doing other things. But at some point, like you said, even in your own journey, you need to go less than full time, may need to take yourself on a sabbatical if you do want to double down, for instance, yourself with ByteLabs or a clinician wanting to do his own startup in that case. And that can be quite a high risk, high rewards. The definition of entrepreneur is someone who is willing to take risks to make a profit. So if you're not willing to do that, then are you really an entrepreneur? I guess.
And this is like one of the single biggest arguments against programs like the Clinical Entrepreneur Program. I have no problem with it. I had a good experience on it. But I think saying that you can be an entrepreneur, in inverted commas, whilst working full time as a clinician, even arguably working part time as a clinician, is, in my view, false when it comes to, like, if you're thinking about entrepreneurship in the classical sense of building a business, scaling it, making it profitable, having employees. I mean, maybe not in the current age, you'll maybe not even have employees, and then heading to some kind of exit. How on earth are you meant to do that 2 days a week? You can't really. It's more, I love the Clinical Entrepreneur Program in some ways because it's, once again, breeding the mindset and networking, making connections, understanding, I guess, what building a product even is. And I know a lot of the people, well, everyone on that program needs to have a startup anyway. But the biggest, that's my biggest complaint about these entrepreneurial programs, is that you can't build a company in the classical sense, and one that is really going to change the world, if that's what you want to do, by working 1 or 2 days a week. But on the flip side, by doing, at least starting at that point, you are de-risking the process massively for yourself. And then when you get to the point of actually cutting all ties with clinical work and saying, I want to do this because this is my life's work for the next 10 years, at least if you don't get to that point, you haven't cut all the ties too early on. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, you have to, if you want to be an entrepreneur in the classical sense, you need to be able to take those big risks and bet on yourself, like, massively.
Is that where your headspace is at now with taking a year out?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I'm keen to see what I can do in doing one thing really well full time for a year, rather than trying to juggle multiple things. And thankfully, and one of the big benefits of working as a trainee in the NHS is the flexibility of being able to take that time out of training. Like, take 1 year out. I'm pretty sure you don't even really need to give a big reason for doing that now. I think also going less than full time, people go less than full time constantly. That's arguably like a very, very normal thing to do now. And you pretty much don't need to give a reason for that either. And there are very, very few careers outside of, like, being an NHS trainee that will just say, yeah, sure, drop to 60%, take a year out, go on a sabbatical for a year. Like, that is a really challenging thing to do outside of the NHS. So I think, as much as I have gripes with working as a doctor in this country, there are things like that which we often all take for granted, that there are processes in place to try and retain the workforce by giving a degree of flexibility as well. How's life, Geeth? Like, how's your journey in digital health?
This is not how it works.
I know you did. Just a final question from you. Did ByteLabs? You're working as a trainee. How are you finding, I guess, juggling both of those interests?
Guess my journey, if we're flip reversing this, I guess when I did ByteLabs, I was in a pretty kind of not in the best position, because I was thinking along the lines of, I just finished CT2, I finished my master's, I finished MRCS, I had a really tough year, and I was probably burnt out as well. So I had about 2 months in between my CT2 job, my ST3 job, where I did ByteLabs, and it really complemented the master's I did in health informatics quite well. It gave me more of that product focus, and almost was a simulation exercise in what it's like to work in a health tech company, which is why I totally agree with what you said. But what I didn't realize is, actually, when you start training, especially as an orthopaedic reg, I can only talk about my experiences. Within probably towards the last 6 months of that ST3 year, I was absolutely loving operating. Right? So I, to the point where I was like, so if I have, if I do a startup, if I earn X amount of money, what would I do? And I was going to say I'd probably be operating, because that's what I really enjoy, right? So for me, I guess everyone's different, but for me, staying in clinical, not just clinical, but specifically orthopedics, started to become more of a draw, because at the start of SG3, I was applying for a few consultancy jobs, had a few interviews lined up, but the pleasure I gained more from operating kind of led me down that path. This year, I'm doing the digital innovation fellowship, which is what this is about, working with Innovate East of England. And I do feel a bit more myself, in terms of I'm balancing the clinical stuff that I'm doing, which I'm enjoying, with more health tech stuff, whether it be with British Orthopaedic Training Association, whether it's with the other side of things in terms of Innovate East of England as well. So going pretty well.
Yeah, amazing. And I think the key thing there is you found the thing that even if money wasn't an object and you had all the money in the world and you built a startup, what would you doing in your spare time? Well, you'd be operating because you figured out that that's really what you're passionate about. That's when you get in your flow state and that's what you love. And that is, if anyone is listening, like if you can find that thing, then you can build your life or professional career around that, right? Like for me, I left surgical training before I even started because when I came in the couple of weeks before and I was in theatre, I was like, there are plenty of other places I would rather be than in an operating theatre. And I guess it's the opposite for you. And that's what makes all our minds very beautiful. And that's how we all work. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So yeah, I know this is you asking me questions, but thank you for sharing.
No, thank you. I think all what you said was going to be really insightful for some of our users, and I think listening to that will resonate with them a lot, especially the ambiguity of it all. So yeah, something to think about. All right, awesome, dude. I'll take care. That's another episode done. We'll see you on the next one.
Amazing. Thanks, Keith.